Stephen M. Gillon was scholar in residence at the History Channel for more than 20 years. He has written 12 books on subjects including A History of the United States, The Kerner Commission, Lee Harvey Oswald, and the Life of John F. Kennedy, Jr. His latest book is titled Presidents at War: How World War II Shaped a Generation of Presidents from Eisenhower and JFK through Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush. Steve Gillon closes his book saying, quote, "Ironically, the threats facing America in the third decade of the 21st century are very real and in many ways similar to the challenges the nation confronted in the 1930s. Steve Gillon, in your new book, Presidents at War, let me just right off the top ask you about George Herbert Walker Bush and his wartime experience. What was it?
So, Bush is really a fascinating story. Here's a guy from privilege who was at Andover when Pearl Harbor took place, and he committed at that moment that he was going to enlist. He enlisted on his 18th birthday. He didn't have to. This is a generation that used their privilege to get closer to combat, not to run away from it. He became a pilot and did a number of missions, dropping bombs on Japanese installations in the Pacific. And it's one run, his plane gets hit, and he goes out to sea, and he's trying to make it out to the carrier, but he can't do it. So he says to his two crewmates to jump, and he assumed they had jumped out of the plane. He put on a parachute and jumped out. When he lands, he realizes that he's not sure that his two men survived, and they did not survive. They died in the plane crash. So here he is in the ocean. He managed to cut free a raft that he climbed onto, but he had nothing to pedal with. So he's sitting there. He's wounded. He had hit his head as he jumped out of the plane. So here's this guy, who could very easily just be at Yale playing baseball, and here he is in the Pacific, just off the coast of a Japanese island. So that's when the fun really begins, because the Japanese see him out there, and they start getting in their boats to go out. And back there are rumors anyhow that the Japanese used to cannibalize American pilots if they caught them. So some of his fellow flyers stayed with him as long as they could, and kept pushing back the Japanese. But at one point, they ran out of gas, so he's all by himself. So he doesn't know what's going to happen. He really thinks he's going to die. And the next thing you know, he sees the cone of this submarine that emerges behind him. And there's that famous photo, of him being rescued and being carried on the submarine. And so, for me, one of the things I wanted to do was not only tell these stories about the dramatic experience that some of these men had, and Bush's and JFK are the two most dramatic, and show how it impacted them in their lives and how it shaped their view of the world. And I think with Bush and Kennedy, it did two things. They all learned the lessons of Munich, right? They believe that that any compromise is a form of appeasement. And Bush, that was still in Bush's head. But Bush also understood war, and he understood the pain of war. So when you read his letters to his family, when he's about to launch repel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, you can see he agonizes over the decision to go to war. And he does so because he knows the consequences. He lost two crewmates. He never forgot them. And so, if I have heroes that came out of this book, or people who I came out admiring more than I did before, it would be Eisenhower, Kennedy, and George H.W. Bush.
How hard did his father work at trying to keep him from going into the service?
He not only did he talk to him, but he had his powerful friends talk to him. He had a spot waiting for him at Yale. And I think Secretary of State Simpson also was encouraging him just to go to Yale. So his father did everything he could to try to convince him But Bush understood that his father had fought in the front lines in World War I. And he was determined, here's a guy. So all these people, most of them have political calculations in the back of their mind, right? So you see Richard Nixon, he's like, okay, when I run for office after the war, everyone's going to know what I did during the war. So not that he wasn't patriotic and not that he wasn't driven by a real sense of defending the country, but there's always that calculation, a political calculation. With Bush, it was pure patriotism. He was outraged by the Japanese attack, and nothing his father or his father's powerful friends could do to prevent him from going. He tells this very touching story about how I think he was in New York going to the train station. His father took him, and he walked and he turned around. He saw his dad crying. He said it was the first time he'd ever seen his dad cry.
What was the story about LBJ and the war?
Well, LBJ is a very unique story. So, and it's classic LBJ, right? So he's a congressman already, and he ran and lost the Senate race in 41, and throughout the campaign he said, if I send your sons over to fight, I'll be in the ditches with them. I'll be fighting right next to them. And so Pearl Harbor happens, and he's like, oh my God, I said all those things. So he immediately leaves the seat. He turns it over to his wife, Lady Bird, to run this congressional office. And he's lobbying Roosevelt. Now, he really doesn't want to go to war. He's looking for some kind of a cushy position. At one point, he suggested, that Roosevelt make him an admiral. But instead, Roosevelt sent him on inspection tours, production tours throughout the West Coast. And he was really bored with that. So he flies back to Washington, and he essentially says to LBJ's secretary, I'm not leaving until I get to see him. So he gets to see LBJ. He gets to see Roosevelt. And he convinces Roosevelt to send him to the Pacific, but also as an observer. And Roosevelt thought it was a good idea because he didn't really trust MacArthur. So he figured, I'll send my boy Lyndon out there and he'll keep an eye on MacArthur for me. So Johnson goes out and he insists on going on a mission, because what's happening is while he's doing all these inspection tours in the West Coast and then he flies out to the Pacific, these stories are appearing in the newspaper back at home. Like, where's Lyndon? He said he'd be in the trenches. So the pressure's building for him to do something. So he convinces a pilot to allow him to go on a mission, a bombing mission with him. So he climbs onto a plane. He's ready to go, but he has to relieve himself. So he gets out, relieves himself. When he comes back, someone is sitting in a seat. So he gets on another plane. Well, that plane that he had been on gets shot down. But what happens with Johnson's plane is not long after they take off, they develop engine problems. So they never really make it to the bombing site. But a well-known Japanese pilot spots them and attacks them and shoots them up. I mean, it was a pretty harrowing minute or so. And by all accounts, LBJ was as cool as a cucumber. And the pilot broke off and they went back and they landed. And everyone was okay. But, so Johnson takes his, 90 seconds of combat and goes to MacArthur and convinces MacArthur to give him a Silver Star. Not the pilot of the plane, not any of the people who actually went on the mission, but Lyndon Johnson. And so Caro talks about this too. It's just, Johnson made a deal with MacArthur. He said, listen, I'll be your man. He's a double spy, right? So he tells Roosevelt he'll be his man in the Pacific spying on MacArthur. Now he's going to be MacArthur's guy in Washington, advocating for him. And he after the war is over, when he's campaigning again for office, he would always, first of all, they didn't have any Silver Stars left. So he went to an Army Navy store and bought one. And every time he gave a speech, he would try to find a disabled veteran in the audience and bring them up and have them pin the Silver Star as if it was for the first time. He must have done it, 50 times. And he wore it, you see the famous the photograph of the his being sworn in as president on Air Force One after JFK's assassination. He's wearing that silver star. So to me, that Johnson's fascinating for two reasons. One is I think that his experience convinced him that he could bend reality, that he could make whatever he wanted to happen. And I think that plays into Vietnam and his disregard for reality. But the real interesting thing about Johnson is he comes back home and he complains to Roosevelt. He writes an essay, he gives a speech on Congress, on the floor of Congress, complaining about the military, about how incompetent they are, and that you always, you need to maintain control of the military. Of course, it's a lesson he forgot when he became president. He didn't have the confidence to challenge his military, and that's another reason why he got involved in Vietnam.
I know this is redundant, but the fact that he had to go to the bathroom and got off that plane and came back and then went to another plane and that plane went down and nobody survived is just absolutely astounding.
It's one of those moments of how history would have changed. What if Lyndon had not had to go to the bathroom? I think about that every time I go to the bathroom now. I think, was this going to save my life?
What about Richard Nixon?
So Nixon's story is twofold. The first part takes place at home. Nixon gets a job with the Office of Price Administration in Washington, D.C. Sorry. And it's a cushy job. And it's considered essential to the war effort, so he's ineligible for the draft. What he takes away from there, the way that experience shapes him, is it makes him really critical of the federal bureaucracy. And, Nixon had already developed a lot of resentment toward people who he thought were less than him, who did better because they had connections. There was this streak of anti-Semitism, and many of the people he worked for and with in the Office of Price Administration were Jewish. Many were New Deal Jewish lawyers, and he just came to resent the bureaucracy. He came to resent the fact that he wasn't getting promoted and other people were getting promoted. But he also, he could have stayed there, but instead, he volunteers. He wants to fight. So he volunteers for the Navy and he gets sent to Iowa somewhere, and he's just not happy. And he lobbies over and over and over again to get to the Pacific. So the thing is about these characters that I learned is they're complicated. Like Nixon, we all know about Nixon and Watergate, and he could be dishonest and devious, but politics played a part of it, but there's also, he was driven like this, everyone else, by a sense of patriotism that our country has been attacked and he wants to contribute to the war effort. So he tries to get to the front line. He doesn't quite make it to the front lines, but he's in a service position behind, and it was bombed many times by the Japanese. He said that the greatest threat came not from Japanese bombs, but from these giant bugs that would crawl over you at night and bite you. But so he comes back, he runs for office as soon as he gets back, and he runs. It's interesting, by this point, JFK is also running and as a war hero, and Nixon wears his uniform and in its first meetings, and he's told, nobody cares. If you're not a hero, don't wear your uniform, because a lot of people don't like officers. So just be Dick Nixon. And he, I think the resentment that he felt, it was less the war itself and his experience in the war that shaped him than it was his experience in Washington before the war, because it built this animus, and it contributed to an animus that already existed. And he carried that with him into the White House. And I think that, more than anything else, is one of the factors that contributed to Watergate.
It's interesting for military people that Richard Nixon and I'm blanking. George Herbert. Well, George Herbert Walker Bush was the first lieutenant. Nixon and Johnson and Jerry Ford were all lieutenant commanders.
Yeah.
At a very young age,
Yeah.
Which leads me to the next one. I mean, I'm going to cover all these. Gerald Ford. How did he get into the service?
So Gerald Ford was a committed isolationist. He was a member of the America First Committee. He believed that some people do today that there was an ocean that separated us from Europe, and whatever takes place there is their business. But he has a complete turnaround when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Now he's back at home in Michigan practicing law, and he enlists, and like Nixon and like Kennedy, he lobbies to get to the front lines. He's originally assigned to be an instructor. I mean, Ford was a powerhouse, so his first job on the ship was to teach fitness. And then he lobbies and he gets to be a rear gunner, and then finally so he's, he wants to be in battle. He doesn't want to just be a guy, a fitness guy. So he saw a lot of combat, and his ship was attacked by kamikaze pilots. So he saw danger up front. The greatest threat to his life came not from the Japanese, but from a typhoon that almost destroyed his ship. And he was heroic in saving the ship. They were told to abandon ship. The captain of the ship thought there was still a chance to save it. And he essentially said to Ford, what happened is all the planes were below deck. And with the waves, they started smashing into each other. And then gasoline leaked, and there were fires, a big fire, which could have consumed the entire ship. And Ford goes down there with a bunch of men, and they put the fire out, and managed to save the ship. And he also had this, his moment where he almost saw death was during the storm. He had just gone to bed, and the storm hits, and he has to make it up to the control tower. And he's making his way across the deck, and he gets knocked over, and he almost falls overside. But I don't know. I've never been on a ship, but apparently there's a lip like this at the end of the ship that prevents tools and things from going over. Well, that lip saved Gerald Ford from going over the side of the ship, and he eventually made it up to the tower. So, all these men had harrowing experiences. Not all of them, but certainly Ford and some of the others had these harrowing experiences, but they almost lost their lives.
But what you're really saying so far, the four we've talked about, they could have easily died in World War II.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And JFK is obviously on that list too.
Yeah, I'm going to get there, but I wanted to, before we go to JFK, because I know you spent a lot of time on JFK, Ronald Reagan.
So Reagan was an interesting figure for me, because we all know he stayed stateside, and in his memoirs and his various apologists have said that he really wanted to participate in the war, but he failed his eye exam. Well, in reality, his studio was lobbying hard to keep him stateside, and they eventually succeeded. And his job during the war was to make, war-related movies, patriotic movies. And so, and the funny thing is, the studios were very concerned that it would hurt Reagan's image if he were not in combat. So they went out of their way to make it seem as if, he's in combat. So there's these, they would run these stories about how, and here's Ronald Reagan home, kissing his wife after having not seen her for so long. They slept in bed the night before. Reagan slept in his own bed. So the studios go into overdrive to create this myth that Reagan was, participating in the war. And so for me, there was a book written not too long ago by a group of political scientists called "Why Leaders Fight." And they came to the conclusion that those who were in the military and experienced tragedy, were the ones who were least likely to use force. And it was those who were in the military but never saw danger who were the ones who were most likely to use force. And to a large extent, I think that holds true. It doesn't make sense for Reagan, though, because what Reagan came away from the war with was a real fear of nuclear weapons. He joined a group for the international control of atomic weapons. And while he shed a lot of his liberal skin and his association with other liberal groups like the ADA, he never lost that fear of nuclear weapons. And so, he's at the right place at the right time when he's president. So when Gorbachev, who is making his overtures, most of Reagan's advisors are telling him, don't do it. He's going to want us to disarm, and then he's going to build up his military. And Reagan, only his Secretary of State, George Shultz, agreed with him. And Reagan pursued it. It took a lot of courage. And he followed his instinct and not his advisors. And I think that the Reagan who contributes to the end of the Cold War, you can trace that back to his fear of nuclear weapons that rose out of World War II. But Reagan, Reagan has a lot of myth makers who would have you believe, number one, that Reagan won the Cold War. He didn't win the Cold War. I mean, most of the credit goes to Gorbachev, but Reagan was the right man at the right time on the American side. And the whole myth about what he did during the war and why he stayed home because the studio lobbied for him to stay home. And Hollywood got into playing the part, too, of making it seem that he's off the war when he's actually, at home sleeping in bed most nights.
What about Jimmy Carter?
Jimmy Carter graduated from the Naval Academy right after the end of the war, I think in 1946. So he never participated in World War II. He served on a submarine during the hottest days of the Cold War, but he never served in World War II.
JFK.
How much time do we have?
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
They made documentaries out of this. Did you make a documentary out of this with the History Channel?
No, I didn't. No. They did a documentary like this, but my book's completely separate. So JFK he's like George H.W. Bush. He's born into privilege. He could easily have found a way using his father's connections to stay out of war. Physically, he never should have been in uniform. I mean, he's such a sickly guy. I mean, Bob Dallek years ago got access to all of Kennedy's medical records, and it's just shocking to read them, all the different ailments that he had, not just his back, but colitis and so many other things. So he couldn't pass the physical for the Army. I think he failed the Navy one as well. But his father lobbied to get him in the Navy. And then and his father, okay, he'll be given a desk job somewhere, which he was. And, he's in Washington around right before Pearl Harbor. And he falls in love with a woman who he nicknames Inga Binga, who the FBI suspected, never proved, but suspected was a German spy. So word gets out. There's a newspaper article about it. Now, anyone else would have been discharged from the military, but instead JFK is sent to a base in South Carolina, as far away as they can get him from Inga Binga as possible. But even then, he still wants to fight. So he lobbies his grandfather to get him PT boat duty, which is like the most dangerous. These PT boats were just wood with gas and some guns on them and torpedoes. And his father was adamantly against it. But his grandfather lobbied, and he got to be on a PT boat. And of course, it leads us to that famous moment where he's in the Pacific and it's pitch dark. The PT boats don't have radar, and a Japanese destroyer just cuts the ship in half. And Kennedy's actions in those hours and days that followed were simply nothing short of heroic. What he did to save his crew, what he did to eventually get them rescued, here's the sick. So he swims when there's a McMahon, one of the people on the boat was heavily burned and couldn't swim. So Kennedy gets his life vest and puts the strap in his mouth. He swims like 2 miles with this guy on his back. He lands on the beach. He's throwing up. His feet are all cut up from Carl. And what's he do? He goes back out again, hoping to catch an American ship going through the channel. And then we all know the story about how he later wrote a note on a coconut, which was discovered by these natives who were working for the Allies, and eventually it leads to their rescue. It was Kennedy says it was the most searing experience of his life. And I think even more than Bush, I think Kennedy is a real intellectual. He really thinks deep about things. And I think that experience made him reluctant to use force once he was in office. But Kennedy, like all these others, are just shaped by the lessons of Munich. Kennedy, in particular, because he was there when Churchill took over from Chamberlain in the House of Commons. So there's these two things that grow out of Kennedy's World War II experience, and one is the lessons of Munich, the idea that we had to treat the Soviets the way we should have treated Hitler during the 1930s, that if we had stood up to Hitler in the 30s, that World War II never would have taken place. So we have a responsibility to stand up to Stalin, who he sees and everyone else sees as a post-war Hitler. And if you read his speeches, he's eloquent and he's powerful in articulating the lessons of Munich. But if you dive deeper, and what you find is that Kennedy's view of the world is much more complicated than that. He recognizes the lessons of Munich. He's not quite sure they apply to other parts of the world, and he's grappling with this. He grapples with this the whole time he's in the presidency, and he really has to grapple with it with Vietnam. But of course, he dies. Vietnam was always a back burner issue for him, and it wasn't until after he died that things fell apart and it was still left to Johnson. But I've always wondered, what if the lessons JFK had learned from World War II would have made him choose a different path in Vietnam. I'll tell you a funny story. So, as you may know, I was close friends with John Jr., and we used to get together and we'd talk politics and history, spend a lot of time talking about his father and his administration. And we got on to Vietnam. And I said to him, John, even if your father had wanted to pull out of Vietnam, I don't think he would have been able to, because the politics were such that he would have, if he had tried pulling out of Vietnam, we'd have the fall of China, and he'd suffer the same consequences that Truman did when China fell. And John didn't say much. The next day, I get a phone call in the afternoon, and John always called me Stevie. He goes, Stevie, I talked to Bob McNamara last night, and he said you're wrong. So what do you do? What do you do about that? Okay, you win.
I know you wrote a book about him, Junior. How did you get to be a friend of his?
So I was at Brown. I went to Brown as a grad student in 1979, which was the same year that John. I always say that I used to tease him that he went to Brown because he found out I was going there. But, so I was his teaching assistant. In his sophomore year, he took a class in modern American political history, and I was his teaching assistant. So I got to know him a little bit there. When those few occasions when he showed up to class, but it was. And then I didn't see him much his junior year, and then in his senior year, we started working out together. I was a frustrated baseball player who helped coach the baseball team, and John was playing rugby but was injured. So we're in this tiny little weight room, the varsity weight room, which is like a dorm room with weights in it, and we were just started working out. Next thing you know, we started working out together, and then he came up to me one time and he's like, Stevie, we need to do some cardio, and I want to play racquetball. And Brown doesn't have racquetball courts. I won't tell you what he described squash as, but he said, we can't play squash, we can play racquetball. So we found a gym in Seekonk, Massachusetts, and 2 days a week, sometimes 3. We'd hop in a little blue Honda and drive to this huge gym, and we, I got a sense of what those football games were like on the lawn in Hyannis, because the racquetball games were just brutal, very physical. We would lift weights. We would sit in the sauna for a while, and thank God, John, there were no cameras back then, no cell phones, because John was like showing off his body, put it that way. And then we'd finish, and the school cafeteria would be closed, so we'd go. There's this fancy new restaurant in Providence called Wendy's, and we used to go there. And of course, John never had money, so I'm a graduate student living on $5,000 a year, and I'm buying him dinner 2 nights a week. Thankfully, it was only Wendy's. So that's where our relationship really got started, and then we just stayed in touch. And I helped him out with George Magazine, and I talked to him 3 times in the week before he died. He was a wonderful guy and a close friend.
Back to presidents this time who didn't go to war. The story of Bill Clinton. I mean, George W. Bush, of course, did the National Guard. Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump did no service at all. And I want to ask you to reflect on.
Sure.
Start with Bill Clinton.
Well, let me just go back a little bit, because I think, Vietnam changes everything. So the generation that experienced World War II and fought in World War II had this very clear mindset, which they tried to impose on the rest of the world, a mindset that was appropriate for Western Europe at the end of the war, but they discovered was not appropriate to Vietnam. So what happens after the 1960s is there's lots of challenges to that worldview. Whether the United States should be the premier superpower, whether communism was a monolithic force that emanated from the Soviet Union. So there's a generation that grows up after Vietnam that begins to challenge many of those assumptions. Bush is really the last of the Munich presidents, last of the presidents who learned the lessons of Munich. But even by his time,
let me stop you just for a moment. When you refer to Munich, give us exactly what you mean for those who may not have paid attention to that.
Right. So, Hitler wanted to carve off a part of Czechoslovakia, Sudetenland, which is it's very reminiscent of what's taking place in Ukraine. It's an area with rich in minerals, and the West had to decide how to deal with him. So Neville Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, went to Munich in 1937, I think it is, and made a deal with Hitler. And he said, we will cede this to you. You can take this land, but that's it. Then we have, as Chamberlain said, peace in our time, as he waived the agreement when he came back to London. Well, obviously, Hitler had no intentions of slowing down, and within the next couple of years, he's conquered most of Europe. So the lesson of Munich is that you can't appease an aggressor, that you can't, this generation learned you can't do to Stalin or any other Soviet leader what Neville Chamberlain and the West did to Hitler. So that was the lesson that was seared into their consciousness, that Stalin became the new Hitler, and they were determined not to make the same mistakes as the West did in dealing with Hitler. So whenever there's a confrontation, there's an issue, you read their speeches and you talk about, I got notes of, meetings, and they're all talking about Munich, about this will be another Munich. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the 2 models that they're debating is whether America attacking Cuba would be a Pearl Harbor, or whether not doing it would be Munich. So they're really framed. This is the historical experience of World War II shapes their mindset. It really becomes a prison, a conceptual prison. And when the world changes, and when the conflicts move from the Western Europe to the developing world, the Munich analogy really doesn't make any sense, but they don't believe that. So that whole generation that fought in World War II to varying degrees embraced the lessons of Munich. And George Bush was the last of those. But George Bush was also very sophisticated. He also understood what Vietnam taught America about the limits of American power, and so he's a transition figure. So then you have, beginning with Bill Clinton. We'll begin with Bill Clinton. So they're all the post-Vietnam world, and they recognize that America has vital interest, that it needs to establish priorities, but they also are not imprisoned by this same lesson of Munich, and they recognize there are limits to American power. They're more judicious in the way they use power. So I think in many ways, we see with Clinton, the exception, of course, is Bush, who launches this full-hearted war against Iraq. But Obama is the same way, same as Clinton, reserved in the use of force. And the thing is, they're grounded in history. They're grounded in an understanding of how Vietnam challenged the lessons of Munich and how the United States needed to adapt to a new world. Then you get to Trump, who has no sense of history, no knowledge of history. His foreign policy is driven by grievance, and more than anything else, there's no strategic vision. So he's really the exception to these presidents that come to power after the end of the Cold War. You can look at, even with Bush, despite the war in Iraq, you can look at the way they define American foreign policy, and they recognize limits, and they recognize the need to project power, but do so judiciously. And they understand that America has certain national interests that need to be protected. With Donald Trump, it's just who he likes and who he doesn't like. And, one day he's calling the head of North Korea Rocket Man, and the next day he's talking about the love letters they're exchanging and thinks he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize for, even though nothing came of those discussions with Kim. So I think the outlier in all of this, from 1945 to 2025, is Donald Trump.
But let me just point out, 1972 is the end of the draft.
Yeah.
All of these, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump, could have all fought in Vietnam. And Joe Biden used asthma as
That's right.
a way to stay out. Donald Trump used bone spurs. Bill Clinton you've got it in the book, and it's a fascinating story about how far he went to avoid going into service because he said he totally was opposed to the war.
Yeah.
And you want to explain what he did and how he did it, the Oxford connection?
Yeah, well, he said that he had never been drafted, and the fact is he had been drafted, and he essentially went to Oxford and waited out until, by this point, we have the lottery system, and if you had a high number in the lottery, you knew you weren't going to be drafted. So Clinton waited until he got a high number in the lottery, and then I think he showed up in Arkansas. He was in the Arkansas ROTC. But the problem with Clinton is the way he lied about it. And he's the only one who lied about how he avoided war, the conflict. And of course, that all came out as soon as he runs for president in 1992. So he's the most devious in explaining it. But you're right. I mean, so Trump had a series of student deferments and a medical deferment. Biden, the same thing, student deferments and a medical deferment. Clinton, I don't know how you explain Clinton, what he had. Obama was born in 1961, so he was too young to fight in Vietnam. But, it goes to this other point, and that's one of the things I try to bring out in the book is just the difference between our leaders now and our leaders then. Kennedy's a classic example. If someone today who was in JFK's shoes would never fight. I mean, even if we still had a draft, they would find a way out of it. JFK broke every rule imaginable in order to get into the military. And not only that, he lobbied even further to get one of the most dangerous missions, ones he clearly was not qualified for, certainly not physically qualified for. And so there's something about this generation that we've lost. Tom Brokaw called him the greatest generation. And to some extent, you see that. You can see that when you look at their actions during the war and how they were overcome by this sense of patriotism and political calculation to some extent. But I kind of downplay that. I think a lot of it is just they were outraged by the attack on Pearl Harbor. They thought their nation was under attack, which it was, and they wanted to serve their nation, even though they had many of opportunities not to fight. And you don't see that. Obviously, we don't have a draft anymore, so it's sort of less imposing. And the draft was what brought the war home to millions of Americans. It was that slip you got in the paper, and you always dreaded getting a slip. I graduated high school in 1974, so I just missed the Vietnam War. But I had friends who went, and people I knew who went, and I think that you miss something. I do think that there is something about having served in conflict, like George Bush did, like Gerald Ford, Richard Nixon, JFK, that tempers your view. I mean, Kennedy said, he wrote a letter one time and he said, there's nothing heroic about war. And I think the problem is that a generation that has never seen war still thinks that war can be heroic. And these men were disabused of that notion.
This is the part of a sentence that you wrote, but I want you to expand on it. The deep psychic wounds of Vietnam.
Yeah. So, Vietnam, it's not just Vietnam. It's the 60s, which Vietnam was a part of. And there was a sense in the 1960s that everything's unraveling. So we emerged from World War II with not only in foreign policy, but in terms of our social relations and this clear sense of right and wrong. And there's a cultural hierarchy in America, with white heterosexual men at top and everyone else sort of filtering down. There were roles that women were supposed to play and men were supposed to play. And what happens is the 60s chip away at each one of those. So you have the Civil Rights Movement, which is the engine that drives a lot of social change in the 60s and the 1970s, challenging the racism and the institutions that support it. You have the women's movement challenging gender roles, the early emergence of the LGBTQ movement, and then in the middle of that is Vietnam. And I think Vietnam is the vortex around which all of those discontents circle. It's the war that the war comes home to every American. We all remember, right? The evening news, turning on Walter Cronkite, and there's Walter Cronkite sitting there with a number of dead and wounded every day, every single day. So I think what Vietnam did for it, instead of, unlike World War II that forged a consensus, Vietnam did just the opposite. For many people, many conservatives, we lost in Vietnam because we lost our will. And they really want to recreate the lessons of World War II. But you have a whole bunch of other people, especially young people, who challenge all the basic assumptions that led us into Vietnam. And I think, I've written about this in other places. I just think that we're still fighting over the legacy of the 60s and over the legacy of the Vietnam War, about what America's role in the world should be, when and how to use force. But also, we're still fighting about the challenge, the cultural challenge that the 1960s posed, of which Vietnam was a part. So if you look at the debates today, I have my own theory about that. Essentially, we have a cultural pyramid that grows out of World War II. If I'm going off track, you can cut me off. Just my producers do this. That usually works pretty well. But at the top were white heterosexual men, and then everyone else fell down, were a lot notches below. And I think what the 1960s did was to flatten that pyramid. It took away the status of a group of people who had been used to being at the top of the pyramid. And they are the people who are now rallying to go back to the way things used to be. But you can't, because all those norms have been incredibly challenged. And so we are fighting a civil war that emerged from the 1960s, and Vietnam played a central role in that.
What do you think the reaction of the American people would be if they reinstated the draft and said we have to go to war in Ukraine against the Soviet Union, not Soviet Union, but Russia?
Yeah.
What do you think the reaction would be?
Well, it's not going to happen with Donald Trump as president, but there's been a lot of discussion about bringing back the draft without all the exemptions that were built into the draft in the 1960s that allowed essentially people of privilege to get out of the war, whether it be going to college or, I taught at Yale for a long time, and I did a lot of research in how Yale students avoided the Vietnam War. And the medical students would come to the various colleges and tell them how to be sick, how they could pretend to be sick to get out of the war. Well, your working class guy doesn't have access to that kind of information. So there are all these inequities built into the draft. So I think what has been argued, I think Charlie Rangel used to be the champion of this, is that you have a draft, everyone goes. And either it's service at home or it's service in the war. But because if there were more people in power whose sons and daughters were going to have to fight, they'd be less willing to go to war. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, there are a few leaders who have had children. Joe Biden, one of them, who were in the service and fought. And there's many members of the Senate too, but very few. And I think for me, I actually like that idea of having service, which of military service could be a part. Because first of all, it creates this common experience, which we don't have anymore. And I think it also will serve as a deterrent for us getting involved in conflicts that perhaps we don't belong.
Now, I mentioned that you had spent a couple of decades with the History Channel.
That's right.
And when I was talking to some folks some historians and all, and I told them I was going to interview you, they said, you got to ask him what he thinks of ancient aliens, pawn stars, swamp people. And they were actually being serious. Are you still attached to the History Channel?
No, I'm not. I retired last year.
Okay. Well, what was your reaction when all of a sudden things changed and the good history stuff kind of took a back seat?
Well, I have an enormous amount of respect for the people who I worked with at the History Channel. And, they have a big challenge. And the problem they face is that they're a commercial network and they have to feed the beast, right? So they have to make a profit. And what happened is there was so much more competition that my show, I had a Sunday morning show called History Center, and I used to get like 600,000 viewers. I would do documentaries that would get like 2 million. Well, now it's hard to get 1 million for a primetime documentary because there's so much competition. So the challenge that these really smart, creative people face is how do you make enough money to stay on the air? And I always understood it as, well, they do those shows so I can do mine. Swamp people supported my documentaries. So I know people say the History Channel sold out. It's not. It's just, this business, it's changed dramatically. It's highly competitive. It's really difficult for especially these small cable networks to survive these days because they're with all the streaming services. And I think history's response to that was, okay, we will produce these popular shows that will create a lot of revenue, and then we'll use that revenue to continue to do the shows. It may not get the kind of ratings, it may not bring in the same advertising dollars, but is really true to our commitment to telling history. And I think that's the balance they've tried to strike. So you're not the first person to ask me that question. I get it all the time and I understand it. But if we were still doing the types of shows I was doing and doing, World War II, we wouldn't be on the air.
So what is your take today then on where history fits in this country? I mean, as you know, when you started, it was pretty popular stuff.
Yeah.
And what's happened to history and where do you go now for history?
That's a really tough question. And I think part of it is, I was trained as, a traditional historian. I got my PhD at Brown. I taught at Yale. I taught at Oxford. And in many ways, the History Channel changed the trajectory of my career because what I discovered is that people love history. I mean, and you know this from doing your book show. I mean, there's a really genuine thirst for good history. But the problem is, and I'll get a lot of heat for this, but I think the part of the problem is the academy itself and the way we train historians. We are trained to talk to each other and not to a broader public. And you're perceived as being a sellout, if you write for a broader public. And I think, that's changing. There are a lot of people in the profession now who are trying to create a space where historians can talk to the larger public. So I had this experience all the time when I would go out, I do a lot of talks, and people would come up to me afterwards and they'd say, "Oh, I love the way you talked about that, but why is history so boring?" Not History Channel, but they tell me their experience when I was in high school. All I had to do was learn dates and memorize things, and it's true. Like most history teachers in high school are they're football coaches, who read the chapter before you and and who barely know more than you do. And I think for me that what brings history to life for me is this whole concept of contingency. The idea that history, we know how it ends, right? So students are like, well, why do we have to study all this? We know how it ends. Well, it didn't have to end that way. There are so many moments along the way where history could have moved in different directions. So what I try to do, so I did these books, 24 Hours, the Kennedy assassination, 24 Hours, Pearl Harbor. And my idea was to put people in the moment. So you only have the information that the president has at that moment. And you see them making decisions. You see it's not easy. And it was by no means certain what the outcome was going to be. And that brings you into the story and helps you to understand it. And I think that's what we need to do more of. I think there is a broad appeal, really a longing for history that makes sense to people's lives. And I think the best history is being written by journalists and has been for a long time now. But I'm hoping there's going to be some movement in the academy so that historians who are professionally trained will learn how to speak to a broader public. But it's challenging. It's difficult because all the reward systems in the academy are designed to do just the opposite.
Well, because you wrote books, and there's 12 of them that are at the front of your book that we're talking about, then this one. How did you were a professor, University of Oklahoma for how many years?
I was in Oklahoma for 20 years.
But how did you wrote books that were not academic. They were for the public.
I had tenure. I just think called tenure.
So you did you get kickback from the
No, not in Oklahoma. No, we had our president, David Bourne, just passed away last week. And Bourne was this phenomenal public intellectual, and he's a politician. So he liked the fact that I was writing books. He liked the fact that I was out in the public. Colleagues in the history department, not so much. But so I had enormous support from the president and the provost throughout my entire career at Oklahoma. And they gave me the space to write books. They gave me the space to work for the History Channel. I went to Oklahoma as a dean. I left Oxford to go to Oklahoma as a dean of an honors college. And then I was started working for the History Channel, doing little things here and there. And then after 9/11, they wanted me to host a show every week. And there were no direct flights between Oklahoma City and New York. So every Wednesday morning I'm flying to New York and flying back on Sunday, and it got to be too much. So I stepped down as dean, and David Bourne created the space for me so that I would still teach, but he gave me a lot of room to do stuff for the History Channel. I've been really, really lucky because I found supportive people who were willing to give me the opportunity to do the things I really love to do. Not that I didn't love teaching, but I think being with the History Channel and the stuff I did for the History Channel was teaching. It's just teaching a different audience. I love talking to seniors, for example. I love talking to vets. You get a world view and a perspective, and sometimes really difficult questions that you have to grapple with. And that's what I love. I find that students, when you're a professor, students, there's a certain deference to you, and I think one of the problems we have, why a lot of professors become egotistical, is that students listen to you and believe what you say, and even though half the time we don't know what we're talking about. And I think when you get out of the academy, there's less of that.
Where do you live now?
So I split my time between my little apartment here in Manhattan, and my home is on South Beach in Miami. And
are you doing a project now?
I am. So my project now is about the Clinton administration. So what happened originally is I signed a Clinton book back in 2019. I had some surgery and I wasn't able to travel to the Clinton Library until March of 2020. I think it was March 13th, which you may remember was the day the world shut down. So the Clinton Library was closed for years, and I had filed all these FOIA requests, so I had all this time. So this is a book I put in front of the Clinton book, and now that it's finished, I'm going back to Clinton. And my perspective is that I think, especially in light of our politics today, that we need to go back and take another look at Clinton, who I think was a better president than he's been given credit for. So I'm hoping that the FOIA requests and the other documents that I'm looking for will help support that case. But if not, I'll follow the evidence where it goes.
The book we've been talking about is Presidents at War: How World War II Shaped a Generation of Presidents from Eisenhower and JFK through Reagan and Bush. And our guest is Stephen Gillon. Thank you very much, sir, for your time.
Brian, this is great. I've been a historian for 25 years, and this taps my career to have a conversation with you. I thank you for all that you've done for authors in promoting books and getting word out there about serious history.
Well, I thank authors for teaching us everything over the last many years. So thank you very much.
Brian, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.